Hello everyone, my name is Holly. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. I'm going to be the presenter of the lecture for this evening. Some of you might have already seen some of my lectures I've done for the Ancient History Society before. For the last couple, I've been accompanied by my friend and fellow committee member and history nerd Owen Pritchard, who unfortunately couldn't help me out with this one this time because he's off busy studying law and actually having a life and filling up his time with important things. Meanwhile, I am currently on the other side of the world in like northern rural Iceland in the middle of the freezing winter, working on a cow farm and researching and putting together this presentation on the side. So although Odin will be missed, I am sure that the two of us will do one again at some point, something to look forward to. But in the meantime, you're stuck with me and my recorded voice. So on that note, just to go through a couple of checklist things I always say, I'm not a professional editor or anything, so I apologize for the sound quality, any background noises you might hear. Also, as a quick note, I'm not a historian, I'm just someone who's very, very nerdy about history. So if anyone has anything else they'd like to share on the topic, something they'd like to correct or expand on, I'm not here in person, unfortunately, to hear it, but I'm sure everyone else in the audience would find it very interesting afterwards. So on that note, let's get started. So to start off, I have a question for all of you. What do Frank Abagnale Jr., the con artist who famously posed himself as a pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, and whose story was then adapted into the movie Catch Me If You Can, a really good movie, by the way, and Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice, and Tyler Durden in Fight Club have in common? Well, spoilers for Fight Club if you haven't seen it.
The first rule of Fight Club is, you do not talk about Fight Club.
They all have to do with made-up identities. People who manipulate perception for a particular agenda, normally one that has to do with personal gain or power, or shaking up a social system. And this is sort of going to be the main topic of my presentation this evening, but of course, this being the Ancient History Society, we're going to take the lens all the way back to the ancient times and looking at examples from way back when. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome to hear that Nero is alive again. Not some rumor whispered in the alleyways, but a man gathering followers, performing on the lyre, issuing orders, and convincing soldiers to fight in his name. An emperor who had been publicly cremated suddenly walking back into history, and thousands of people were willing to believe it. The ancient world was obsessed with heroes, kings, and gods. But it was equally fascinated by liars, imposters, thieves, pretenders, and tricksters. People who slipped through the cracks of society, who bent reality, who gamed systems, staged miracles, or turned deception into an art form. And most interestingly, people who exposed just how fragile power, identity, and authority really are and have always been. And it's interesting how every ancient culture has had some figure like this. Whether it's Loki in Norse mythology, Hermes in Greece, Anansi in West Africa, the coyote and raven in many Native American traditions, Sun Wukong, the Monkey King in China, and even Set in ancient Egypt, the god of chaos, disruption, and violent unpredictability. They are shapeshifters, rule breakers, boundary crossers. They lie, they disguise themselves, they mock authority, and survive through wit rather than strength. And they've never really disappeared throughout human history. They've simply changed costume, and we keep retelling their stories. In our literature, our theatre, our films, from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night to The Count of Monte Cristo to The Man in the Iron Mask, to The Usual Suspects, and from The Talented Mr. Ripley to even Aladdin. Famous examples of pretenders or tricksters or imposters, from legends in history to modern pop culture. The names change, the settings change, but the obsession with them doesn't. We're still captivated by people who reinvent themselves, and what their deceptions reveal about the world's willingness to believe them. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at 6, I think, truly fascinating examples from history. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the false Neros. We all know the great Roman Emperor Nero and his rather unfortunate ending at the age of 31. Now, as a brief reminder, in 68 AD, Nero's authority was not doing quite so well in Rome, and it was beginning to collapse. The governor Gaius Julius Vindex rebelled and called upon Praetor Galba in Spain to oppose Nero. And although this revolt was crushed by the German legions under Lucius Virginius Rufus, his own troops tried to proclaim him as emperor, showing that Nero had lost control of the regions. Support for Galba was continuing to grow, even within the Praetorian Guard. Faced with revolt, a rival claimant, and a wavering military loyalty, Nero panicked. Nero looked to flee the capital, reach Ostia, and make for the eastern provinces, which had been supportive of him during his reign. But this plan was interrupted when some of the guards he had ordered to flee with him refused. Returning to the imperial palace, Nero mulled over his options. But upon hearing the news that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, Nero finally decided on committing suicide. Although even as the agents of the Senate could be heard approaching, he still was too scared to do it himself, and he needed his private secretary, Epaphroditus, to carry out this suicide. It is said that one of the Senate's horsemen entered and saw that Nero was dying, and he attempted to stop him bleeding, but the efforts to save Nero's life were unsuccessful. Nero's final words are said to be, too late, this is fidelity." But despite his body being seen by dozens of witnesses and cremated and then buried in what is now the Villa Borghese in Rome, his death was surprisingly quiet. There was no huge, big public funeral, and people started asking questions about whether or not he was actually still alive. Rumors started spreading that he had escaped. People knew that Nero had spoken of fleeing east, and he was still decently popular amongst the urban poor in Greece, and not to mention he was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. All of this created the perfect condition for imposters. And within a generation, at least 3 different men claimed to be Nero, returned from the dead. The first false Nero was reported in 69 AD, just 1 year after the emperor's death. An unnamed man, believed to be a runaway slave from Pontus, reportedly looked a lot like Nero and could sing and play the cithara, critical since Nero was famous as a performer. This man apparently was so convincing that he was able to gather runaway slaves, deserters, and adventurers in the Greek islands, and planned to set sail east to Egypt or Syria, where Nero had been especially popular. But en route, they experienced some bad weather, and this forced them to land on Kythnos, where the fake Nero met some soldiers returning east on leave, who refused to believe that he was in fact the real emperor, and so he executed them to stop spreading the news. This would be a fatal mistake, however, as the executions caused panic around the island, and soon the news reached the newly appointed governor of the region, a man called Calpurnius Asprinus, who ended up hunting the fake Nero and his crew down, where the impostor was captured and then executed. And this time, to be extra sure, his body was sent back to Rome as proof. The second false Nero appeared under the reign of Emperor Titus from about 79 to 81 AD. The impostor was an Asian Greek man called Terentius Maximus, who resembled Nero and performed music as well. This Nero claimed that he had escaped from the soldiers who had been sent against him, and that he had been living in concealment somewhere up until this time. This story must have been convincing, because shortly after Maximus came forward, he gained the protection of a Parthian king, Rome's great eastern rival. The Parthians had good memories of Nero, and were happy to use the returned emperor as a sort of political weapon. They even promised him military aid in restoring him to the imperial throne. However, something must have happened. Most likely his true identity was somehow uncovered, and the Parthian king recognized that the impostor was of little use to him, and in an attempt to show an act of good grace to Rome, he had Terentius Maximus executed. We know of at least one other fake Nero who came forward in about 88 AD, who also tried to gain the support from the Parthians. Historians say that even decades later, Nero's name was so powerful it could be used to rally up followers and cause brief moments of crisis across the country. Nero's youth, popularity, and mysterious death, and not to mention the chaotic time of unrest and civil war that followed his death, made people want him to be alive even more. In the eastern provinces and in Parthia, Nero became a sort of political tool as much as a person. In a very real sense, Nero became a role that other people could step into. The false Neros showed that in the ancient world, identity itself could be forged. An emperor did not so much need to exist, he only needed to be believed in. Next, we're going to be talking about Alexander of Abonotychus. Abonotychus. Yeah, that's about as good of a pronunciation I think I'm going to get. As far as the history of frauds and conmen goes, few figures are as intriguing as Alexander of Abonotychus, a self-proclaimed prophet and oracle who captivated the hearts and minds of many during the Roman Empire. His story is one of ambition, deception, and a relentless pursuit of power, set against the backdrop of a changing society. Alexander of Abonotychus was born in the city of, wait for it, Abonotychus, located in the region of Paphlagonia, which is now modern-day Turkey. He is best remembered as the founder of the Glykon cult, which briefly gained widespread popularity throughout the Roman Empire. Now, it must be said that not much is known about the early life of Alexander, but according to one of the few resources we do have about him, for most of his young life he worked as a male sex worker, until he encountered and entered into a romantic and commercial relationship with one of his clients, a magician who boasted to be a disciple of Apollonius of Tyana, who was a Greek philosopher and religious leader of the time. Alexander then accompanied his lover in his travels and learned his craft, and it's even been suggested that this person might have taught him some pharmaceutical and medical law, which in future would be helpful as a means of gaining credibility. But after the death of his lover, lacking the means to provide for himself, and at that time probably too old to gain money from sex work because, he was in his late teens, which is very old, obviously, he decided to do the only thing he could do. He decided to put into use the craft and the skills that he had learned from his lover. The Glykon cult emerged in the 2nd century AD, during the time where the Roman Empire was experiencing a surge of various religious movements and mystery cults. This time was perfect. It was fertile ground that Alexander could begin to cultivate his persona as a prophet. Alexander claimed to have received divine revelations from a serpent deity that he called Glykon, who he presented as a manifestation of the god Asclepius, the god of healing and medicine. Glykon was depicted as a snake or a serpent with a human head, symbolizing both wisdom and healing. And the tale he created around the deity went something like this. Alexander encountered a group of snakes during his travels. In the tale, Alexander was walking amongst the snakes, and rather than them harming him, he manages to communicate with them. The snakes, in turn, impart a secret knowledge and teach him the ability to see the future. With a charismatic presence and a silver tongue, he began traveling from town to town, weaving tales of divine visions and celestial messages. His followers started growing and growing in numbers, drawn in by the promise of hope and the allure of his prophecies, eager for a savior in the time of uncertainty. And I think what made him a particularly compelling leader, which has been used by many cult leaders effectively throughout history, was his ability to tap into both the fears and the desires of people. He spoke of impending doom, because fear is obviously a powerful way to grab people's attention, but he also spoke of a glorious future, something to motivate people to believe in him. His prophecies often mirrored the anxieties of the time, addressing issues such as famine, war, and political corruption. People from all around came to ask him questions. It was said that during his prosperous years, he delivered nearly 80,000 replies to people concerning bodily, mental, and social afflictions. But, like all cult leaders, his true intentions slowly came to light. As his influence grew, so did the complexity of his prophecies. Alexander began to intertwine his messages with political aspirations, presenting himself as not just a prophet, but a political leader. He promised to guide his followers into a new area of prosperity, and this brought about plenty of attention, but also plenty of skepticism. People started to question the authenticity of his prophecies and the motives behind them. Roman authorities, wary of his growing influence, began to take notice, and they viewed him as a potential threat to the stability of the Republic. In a dramatic turn of events, a series of failed prophecies began to chip away at Alexander's credibility. As famine and unrest continued to plague the region, his once loyal followers grew doubtful. The promises of salvation turned to ashes, and people could see it. And the authorities seized the opportunity to discredit him, branding him as a fraud and a charlatan. But despite this, Alexander was able to reach the impressive age of 70 and died due to gangrene of the leg. Not a good way to go. Now, the disturbing thing for me is although Alexander's story may belong in the ancient world, the pattern is uncomfortably familiar. Charismatic leaders who promise hidden knowledge, divine authority, and salvation in uncertain times have never disappeared. From modern-day cults to internet prophets and conspiracy theories, the world might have changed, but the same tools, fear, hope, and performance still remain. Moving on, now we're going to be looking at Agnotus of Athens. Now, some of you might have heard of her. Agnotus of Athens is genuinely credited to be the first known female midwife, and the tale of her life suggests that she disguised herself as a man, was educated under one of the key medical practitioners of her time, and went on to practice medicine in ancient Athens. The story goes that Agnotus was born in the 14th century AD into a wealthy Athenian family, and appalled by the high mortality rates of infants and mothers during childbirth in ancient Greece, she decided that she wanted to study medicine. However, she was born in a time that forbade women from practicing any form of medicine, especially gynecology, and it was a practice that was a crime punishable by death. There was a time, however, where women were allowed to be midwives, at least informally. Childbirth was frequently overseen by close female relatives or friends of the expected mother, many of whom had undergone labor themselves. This position became increasingly formalized, with women who were experts at supporting others through birth becoming known as Maya, or midwives. Female midwives began to flourish, sharing extensive knowledge about contraception, pregnancy, abortion, and birth. The story goes that as soon as men began to recognize the capability of midwives, they began to clamp down on the practice. Let's just say they were worried about women's capabilities to tamper with potential lineage, and were generally threatened by women's increasing sexual liberation, granting them more of an ability to make choices about their bodies. This repression was increasingly formalized with the introduction of schools of medicine, founded by Hippocrates, generally considered to be the father of medicine, in the 5th century AD, which barred women from entry, and it was around this time that being a midwife became punishable by death. Agnotus, however, did not let this stop her. She famously cut her hair and dressed in male's clothes in order to travel to Alexandria and gain access to male-only medical training centers. Pretty soon she had done enough to prove her skill and was given the opportunity to be taught by one of the most prominent physicians of the time, Herophilus. A follower of Hippocrates, he was the co-founder of the famous medical school in Alexandria. But he became known for a number of medical advancements in gynecology and is often credited with discovering the ovaries. Agnotus's disguise was apparently so convincing that upon arriving at a woman's house to assist in her birth, the other woman would try to refuse her entry. She would then have to reveal herself to be a woman in order to gain the trust, and was then permitted to help ensure a safe delivery for both mother and child. As the word spread about Agnotus's abilities, pregnant women increasingly asked her for medical assistance. Still under the guise of a man, Agnotus grew increasingly popular, which angered male doctors of Athens at the time, who claimed that she must have been seducing women in order to gain access to them. It was even claimed that women must have been faking illnesses in order to get visits from her. It is said that she was initially brought to trial because she was accused of engaging in inappropriate behavior with her patients. And in response, Agnotis undressed to show that she was a woman, and this caused an outcry amongst male doctors who demanded that she be put to death. But when word hit the street, hundreds of women came out in her defense, claiming that she had saved their lives and their children's lives. Agnotis' sentence was eventually overturned, and the law was apparently amended not too long after that so that free-born women could study medicine. Now, I know that the story sounds almost too good to be true, and the fact of the matter is historians have argued about whether or not she did actually exist. In fact, there's only one ancient reference to Agnotis that is known to exist, and that is the story of her that appears in Fabulae, which is a collection of biographies written by a Latin author called Gaius Julius Hyginus, who we know for sure wrote some of his biographies about mythical figures, or at least exaggerated the stories quite a bit. But to be honest, I don't think that really matters. I still think her story very much deserves a place on this list, as I think it's a brilliant example of someone who lived a life of deception ultimately for a greater good. That this sort of topic isn't always about people pretending and putting their life on the line for personal growth or power, but sometimes, if not all of the time, human beings are a lot more complicated than that. Whether or not she actually existed, Agnotis has become a figurehead for marginalized women in medicine, and her story has commonly been quoted by women facing barriers in studying gynecology, midwifery, and other related professions across the world. For example, she was notably referenced a lot in 18th century Europe at the peak of women's struggle to enter the medical profession. If you want a really good example, I recommend looking up the story of the real-life French inventor and midwife Marie Boivin. I don't have time to go into it now, but her story is also pretty extraordinary. And speaking of women who disguise themselves as men who might have not actually existed, but whose story and legend has remained impactful throughout history, let's talk about Mulan. And yes, many of you will probably have heard of her because of the Disney film, which I'll just go ahead and say is one of the best Disney films out there for this song alone. Mr. I'll make a man out of you. Or this scene alone.
That's it! Dishonor! Dishonor on your whole family! Make a note of this. Dishonor on you! Dishonor on your cow!
But going back to the historical figure, Mulan is the heroine of one of the most famous folk poems, the Ballad of Mulan, believed to have originated sometime around the 5th and the 6th centuries during the Northern Wei dynasty, over 1,500 years. Now, it's worth saying that there's no clear historical record proving that she actually existed, but for people having told her story as though she did over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The ballad tells us that Mulan was a young woman living at the time when the emperor was calling for soldiers to defend the realm from invading forces. Each household was required to send a man. Mulan's father was named in the conscription note, but he was old and unwell, and she had no older brother to take his place. Faced with the choice between watching her father march towards an almost certain death or breaking every social rule placed upon her, Mulan chose deception. She cut her hair, dressed in a man's clothing, brought a horse and weapons, and presented herself to the army as a son instead of a daughter. According to the poem, she served for more than 10 years. 10 years marching, fighting, sleeping beside her fellow soldiers, sharing camps, hardships, battles, and battlefields, without her secret ever being discovered. During this time, she disguised herself in combat, rose through the ranks, and survived campaigns that killed soldiers and experienced generals alike. Eventually, after a long and successful military career, Mulan was summoned to the imperial court. The emperor offered her a high-ranking position and lavish rewards. But she refused them all, asking only for a fast horse to take her home. And it is only when she returned to her family, changed back into woman's clothing, and stepped out to greet her former comrades, that the truth was revealed. The soldiers who fought beside her for over a decade are said to have been utterly stunned. We travelled together for 12 years, the poem says, and we did not know Mulan was a woman. The ballad ends with a quiet but quite pointed reflection. When two rabbits run side by side, Who can really tell which is male and which is female? And I think that's quite a powerful question for a couple of reasons. First of all, rabbits are traditionally used in Chinese symbolism to represent softness, timidness, fragility, traits that are often culturally coded as female. But Mulan reframes them in motion. They're running. When they're acting and moving, the distinctions vanish. What matters is not they are, but what they are doing. And I think that in the context of the poem, it's a subtle argument about ability and courage, that these are not gendered qualities. And I think, secondly, it criticizes social order without openly attacking it. It doesn't shout that gender roles within society are false. It just asks a question, and I think sometimes questions are a lot more dangerous. It leaves the audience sitting with a bit of a discomfort, and whether or not Ha Mulan was a real person is still debated. But like Agnotus of Athens, her story has expanded so much more than I think just this question. In the context of tricksters and imposters and hidden identities, Mulan represents a different kind of fraud. For she deceives people possibly for the noblest reason one can, to protect someone she loves. She reminds us that sometimes deception isn't about taking advantage of a system, but it's about finding a way to exist within a system that was never really built for you in the first place. I must apologize for the complete butchering of French names in this next section. Okay, so I know this is the Ancient History Society, but stepping out of ancient history for just a second and jumping to the Middle Ages, because I think the story is well worth it. We all know Joan of Arc, or her proper French name, Jeanne d'Arc. Patron saint of France, honored as the defender of the French nation in her role in the siege of Orleans. Her insistence on the coronation of Charles VII of France during the 100 Years' War. I don't need to read her Wikipedia page, we all know her. In 1431, she was famously publicly executed by the English in Rouen. She was burned before crowned, her ashes were thrown into the Seine, and her death was made to be unquestionable. And yet, within a few years, there was a young woman walking around France claiming to be her. Let me introduce you all to Jeanne d'Amoise, also known as Claude d'Amoise, a soldier, adventurer, and one of the most successful imposters of the Middle Ages. She was armed, dressed like a man, drank deep, danced with men, and called herself Jeanne la Pucelle, or Joan the Maid, or the Virgin. She told stories of escape, she performed minor feats claiming that they were acts of magic, such as breaking glasses and tearing napkins, then putting them back together or making them whole. She fought in battles and even slayed 2 men who tried to challenge her one day in a bar. Pretty soon, she had hundreds of people convinced that she was the maid returned from the dead. And what makes her story extraordinary is not just that some people believed her, but who believed her. Joan of Arc's own brothers, Pierre and Jean, publicly accepted her as their sister. The city of Orleans welcomed her. Annual memorial services for Joan of Arc's death were suspended. Nobles even funded her travels. She was entertained, she was gifted and paraded around France and beyond, living for years inside one of Europe's most famous identities. And by now you might be asking, how could it be possible when thousands of people witnessed Joan of Arc's death? How could her own brothers believe this ruse? Well, it wasn't just blind ignorance. Many of the nobles who met Jeanne d'Amoise had actually met the real Joan of Arc and had even spoken with her. And yet, at a country still at war where Joan of Arc had become a symbol of divine favor and national survival, the idea that she had lived was not only comforting, it was useful, and so people went along with it. But everything changed in 1439 when she was brought before King Charles VII, and from the start, he wasn't entirely convinced. He tested her the same way he had once tested Joan of Arc, presenting a false king at first and waiting to see if she would recognize him to be false. And she did. So far, so good. But then when the king asked her to tell him a secret that only Joan of Arc had told him, the sign that she had claimed had come from God all those years ago, Jeanne d'Amoise could not answer. She was stuck. And so she confessed and begged for forgiveness, and the illusion was shattered. And yet, remarkably, Her story does not come to an end there. Even after her confession, her life was spared, and Joan of Arc's brothers continue to treat her as if she really was their sister. And she went on to marry the knight Robert des Amboise, which is where she got her name. She retired to his castle at Jaulny and had 2 children and sort of lived happily ever after. Jeanne des Amboise succeeded not just because she was convincing, but because people around her let themselves get convinced. They wanted to be. The English had gone to great lengths to prove Joan of Arc's death, precisely because they feared people would not believe it, because they knew that people would still want her to be alive somehow. The French wanted hope. And so I think Jeanne des Amboise did not so much replace Joan of Arc the person, but rather she replaced the hope that Joan of Arc had once brought. Staying in the Middle Ages, let's move on to Lambert Simnel. His story is interesting because it tells the story of someone who did not, in all likelihood, make the choice himself to become an imposter, but rather someone who was seen as an opportunity and used. In 1487, only 2 years after the War of Roses had ended, a boy of about 10 years old was crowned the King of England. This would be the youngest person to be crowned, albeit falsely, in English history. His name, at least as history remembers it, was Lambert Simnel. Almost nothing is known about his early life for certain, not even his real name. We have accounts of some people calling him Simnel, but some calling him John. His father, in different accounts, was a baker or a tradesman or an organ builder. However, the one thing we do know about Lambert Simnel, wherever he might have come from, was that he was not noble. Certainly, he was not royal. He was a common child from an ordinary background. But his transformation began when he caught the attention of an Oxford-educated priest called Richard Simons. Simons noticed the boy because he was quick, handsome, and impressionable. And Simons saw an opportunity. He decided to take the 10-year-old boy under his wing and educate him in noble manners, courtly speech, and royal behavior. At first, Simons intended to present him as one of the lost princes in the Tower. Now, for a quick history lesson, the lost princes in the Tower were King Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9. And these were both the sons of Edward IV. And they were put in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard III, for a set of reasons involving what turned out to be invalid marriage contract, which we don't really have time to get into, which ended up making the princes illegitimate and illegible for the throne. So Simons basically tried to play it off that Lambert Simnel was one of the princes, but ended up changing his plan at the last minute in 1487, when rumours had spread that Edward, the Earl of Warwick, a different Edward this time. Basically, this Edward was the cousin of the 2 lost princes and the genuine heir to the English throne. It turns out that he'd been thrown in prison by the new king, Henry VII, and died. And Simon saw this as an even better opportunity. And so, because he was rumoured to be dead and it was a good opportunity, Lambert Simnel became Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick. And it turns out that the real Earl of Plantagenet had not died in prison and was in fact alive in the Tower of London, but hidden from public view. And so this still made him perfect, because Simnel was close in age, he was trained to perform in nobility, and could be shaped into a living symbol for Yorkist loyalists who still rejected the new traitor king, Henry VII. Now, in order to make the plan work, Simons took the 10-year-old boy to Ireland, the stronghold of the Yorkist support, and there something extraordinary happened. Simnel was paraded around Dublin and lifted onto people's shoulders like a newly discovered ancient relic. Noble households received him, crowds gathered. Plenty of powerful and dangerous men like John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, and other Irish lords at the time came forward, and in all likelihood knew that the boy was an impostor, but like Simons, saw him for the opportunity he presented. And so on May the 24th, 1487, inside the Christchurch Cathedral, a child who had been born a nobody was crowned King Edward VI. He wore a crown. He heard Mass said in his name. He was treated formally and publicly as England's rightful heir. But the 10-year-old boy Simnel was not the mastermind behind all of this. He was just a face, a pawn for other people's ambition. Once enough of a rebel army was rallied in Dublin behind the boy king, they made their way into England and marched inward, hoping for support that never truly came. On June the 16th, 1487, they met King Henry VII's army at the Battle of Strokefield, what's often considered to be the last major battle of the War of the Roses. The fighting was brutal, and the Yorkist leadership was killed. The rebellion collapsed. But what happened next is one of the strangest endings in the history of royal imposters. Henry VII did not execute the boy. He recognized what Simnel truly was. Not a traitor, but a tool, the crown that had been placed on his head by others. And so, instead of the scaffold, Lambert Simnel was sent to the royal kitchens as a spit-turner. And remarkably, Simons, being a priest, was also spared execution under church law. Nevertheless, he was imprisoned for life. And after a few years of working in the kitchen, Lambert Simnel would go on to be a royal falconer, which is a falcon trainer, which is not a bad position in royal court. And so it was that a child who had once been crowned England's youngest king spent the rest of his life training birds. Isn't that quite an interesting story? So those are the 6 examples from history we've looked at today, and I hope you guys have enjoyed learning about them as much as I enjoyed researching them. So in closing, I'd like to ask the question that keeps popping up in each of these examples is, why do figures like this keep appearing again and again in every civilization we study? Well, I mean, from my side, I think it's quite a simple answer. I think it's because they're interesting. They emerge most clearly in societies that are structured and stratified and tightly controlled. And a trickster walks straight into these systems and survives not by force, the way we're used to, but by reading those societies better than anyone else can. Their stories endure, I think, because they expose what the culture is trying the hardest to protect. They reveal the fault lines beneath authority. They reveal that bureaucracies can be fooled, that religions can be staged, that elites can be flattened, and that crowds very easily can be persuaded. Again and again, we see the same uncomfortable lesson, that power often rests less on reality and more on recognition, on whether people agree to treat someone as a poet or a king or a noble or a savior. Tricksters cross the boundaries societies insist are fixed, between the sacred and the profound, between the hero and the criminal, male and female, between human and divine. And in doing so, I think they turn identity into something that's quite unstable, something you can rehearse and costume and convince others to accept. And they haven't gone anywhere. We still live amongst tricksters. They just work with different tools, with algorithms and social media and conspiracy theories instead of, sacred spaces and oracles and prophecies. But their methods are hauntingly familiar. Charisma, fear, hope, and the careful performance of authority. To quote the historian Henry Jefferson, tricksters flourish in rigid societies. The more hierarchical the world, the more delicious the story of someone who cheats it, and the more revealing. Now, let's be clear, I use different examples purposefully to try and emphasize the fact that people pretend and trick and lie for all sorts of reasons. The good, the bad, and everything in between. But I think either way, by watching them, by reading about them, by learning about them, we're forced to confront an unsettling possibility. That much of what governs our lives only works because we collectively agree to believe in it. And that is my presentation for today. Thank you everyone for coming out and listening. I know that recorded talks don't always seem to be as interesting because you're not seeing the person actively presenting their presentation in real life, but I had a lot of fun researching and recording this from afar, and I hope you guys enjoyed it nonetheless. And thank you to the Ancient History Society for letting me come and do another presentation. Thank you to my friend Odin and fellow committee member for the idea behind this presentation. I'm sorry you couldn't join me this time, but we'll have to do one again at some point. And yeah, I hope you guys have learned something, and I hope I've made you think a little bit. I'm not here in real life, obviously, to answer questions, so I get to get away with that, which I'm very happy about. But if anyone has questions, why not just ask my friend Odin? He's very smart, and he also knows a lot about history, and I like throwing him under the bus for no reason. No, but in all seriousness, if you guys have questions, research. There's lots to be found out there. There was a lot I had to cut out just for the sake of time. So go out, research, learn, be curious. It's all very, very good. That's what we try and encourage at the Ancient History Society. We want people to be curious. So on that note, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their evening. Thank you once again for coming out, and hoping to see you at the next one.